episode, we are joined by a local grief counselor and an old friend. And then you'll get to hang out with two local scenesters chatting about do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do. Yep, the Twilight Zone. You're listening to Open Here, a podcast produced by PACTV. I'm Tiff Phillips. Let's get started. Hi, friends. Hope all is well and wonderful. We have a great episode for you today. For many, grief is hard to talk about. There's no handbook for the loss you feel after losing a loved one. But our next guest has some sage advice that comes from a place of knowledge. Join me as I chat with Gary Sturgis, author and grief specialist for Hope Floats Healing and Wellness Center. I'm with Gary Sturgis, grief specialist. It is such a pleasure to see you again. We meet again.
Yes, it's good to be back.
So I gotta mention that Gary helped us win the Creator Award for a piece we did last year. Can you tell me your reaction when you found out?
I was so happy and surprised. I just happened to come across on the internet and I was like, oh my God, they actually won for my segment. So that's great. I'm so proud of you guys.
Oh, I'm proud of you. I mean, we couldn't have done it without you. Your story is remarkable, and the advice and the impact you have on people is just immeasurable. So Thank you from the bottom of our hearts. Thank you so much. I'd like to give listeners a refresher. How did you become a grief specialist?
So I had a lot of significant losses in my life. Mostly when I lost my husband, Rob. I lost him in 2009 to metastatic melanoma, which is a fancy term for a really bad cancer. And then I just recently, 2 years ago, actually today's the anniversary of my dad's death. So I lost my dad 2 years ago. And so, I think the significant losses I've had in my life were obviously my husband and my dad, but I've also lost, losing a spouse was a whole different kind of grief for me. And so losing Rob, I never realized how bad grief could actually be. I had lost my grandparents and I was sad and I was younger. And, I think when you're younger, you tend to kind of bounce back a little quicker. But when you lose that person who's your person, your go-to person, that's a tough one. And so I felt really alone in it. And I think anyone that loses someone significant that they love feels alone. So I just decided at some point I didn't want to ever have anyone feel as bad as I did. So that's why I went into doing what I did. And I went to a grief support group. And when I went to that grief support group, there were people in that group like me, which made me feel less alone. And so I decided I wanted to do that. And that was how I started out. I started being a group facilitator for bereavement support groups with people that lost a partner or spouse. And then it just snowballed from there.
Can you tell us a little bit about you and your husband's story?
So we met later in life. So I was about probably in my late 30s when we met. And back then, it wasn't legal to get married. So we were together for quite a while. And then we got married in 2005. It became legal in 2004. And he was just a great guy. He was in the Navy. So he was a protector. He made me feel safe. And, losing him was really hard. It's hard to lose that person that's your go-to person that you're with, 24/7. So, yeah, he was a great guy.
Speaking of that, what do you want the world to know about Rob?
I want the world to not forget about Rob. And I tell people all the time that I work with as a grief specialist that it's so important to talk about the person that you lost. It's so important to tell your story, because the more you tell your story, the more you keep that person alive. And I always say you're never forgotten until someone stops saying your name. So if I want them to remember anything about him, it's that he was here and that he mattered and that his life mattered and that he was a good person.
He definitely mattered. Loss is not a stranger to any of us. We will all lose somebody. When it initially happens, your brain kind of goes through that, like, is this real? Like, it's very surreal. Is that the brain basically telling the body that, like, to be in protective mode, that, like, you're protecting yourself from what's actually going on?
Exactly. And I think what it is, too, is that your brain, your heart is trying to catch up to your brain, or your brain's trying to catch up to your heart, whichever way it's going to go. The reality, when you lose someone significant that you love, when you lose them, it's almost a shock, so you're in a fog for such a long time in the beginning, because you can't even wrap your head. It's so difficult to even wrap your head around the fact that this person no longer exists. Like, you're not going to see this person, touch this person, hear this person. And so I think when that happens, your brain is kind of protecting your heart from that, because in your heart, you know the person's gone and you're missing that person and you're so sad about it, but your brain hasn't really taken in that reality. There's that day that comes when you finally say to yourself, my God, this person's really not coming back. And that's tough. So I think that's where the connection is. It's taking your brain a while to catch up with your heart.
How long did it take for you to be able to talk about it and to gradually help others with their experience?
It's a process, and it's a process for everyone. For me, the whole first year, honestly, I couldn't even tell you what I did that whole first year. I mean, I joined a support group, and I also did one-on-one grief counseling with a counselor, but it was just such a fog. And I always say the first year is kind of like the year of magical thinking. There's all these things going on in your head that, you know, you can't even wrap your head around what's happening or what's going on. So for me, I would say at least a year it took me before I could even talk about it, and then several years before I could talk about it without crying, you know, without having it come bubbling up again. So it's a process. I always say it's like cutting your arm. You know, it's gushing out, bleeding horribly in the beginning, and then as it heals, it's not bleeding as much, but in the end, no matter how much time goes by, you might have that scar that's left on your arm. So every time you look down on your arm, you see that scar, and it reminds you of what happened. It's the same way when you lose somebody. Yeah. You know.
How has helping other people helped you in your grieving process? Has that brought you a bit of comfort?
Absolutely. And I always tell people that the best way to heal your heart is to help someone else. Because if you can take yourself out of your own head for a little while, you know, take yourself out of, you know, I always say it's great to have a pity party for one, but just don't stay there, you know. And so when you're helping someone else, you know, volunteering is a great thing to do. If you're grieving, go out and volunteer and help someone else. The minute you help someone else, it makes you feel good about yourself, because it gives you a sense of purpose. And that's one of the biggest things you lose when you lose somebody you love, is what's my purpose now? You know, whether you lose a child or a spouse or a parent, you somehow lose what your purpose was, especially if you were a caregiver for that person. So I think helping other people definitely heals your heart.
When we interviewed you last time, you had brought this beautiful line, and it said, when the casseroles stop coming, it's when people tend to leave and think, you know, they're fine now. Like, I gave them a couple lasagnas, they're good to go. How do people navigate through that when people just stop dropping by to say, are you okay?
It's tough. You know, grief lasts longer than sympathy. And so, you know, you have a lot of support when someone first dies, and then all of a sudden those people drop away. You know, the reality of life is people go back to their own lives. You know, everyone has their own life, and they feel bad for you and they feel sorry for you, and they're there for you in the beginning because they figure that's when they need you. But what they don't realize is sometimes you need people more after a lot of time has gone by, after what I was talking about, when that first year fog lifts and all of a sudden the reality sets in, and then that's all of a sudden when everybody's gone. So I think it's our society's way of saying, like, you did this for X amount of time, you should be okay now, and you're never really okay, because grief is forever. You know, once you lose someone you love, you're going to grieve that person. That doesn't mean you're going to be in severe pain for the rest of your life, but you're going to grieve that person for as long as you live. Until the day you die, you're going to miss that person.
You've also written a couple of books. Can you talk about what that process was like, and kind of taking your thoughts and putting them down on paper for others to learn about?
Sure. So when I was going through my grief counseling, my counselor said to me, you know, a good way to get out your feelings is to write them down. And, you know, even though counseling and support groups work for some people, talk doesn't work for everybody. So some people express their grief in different ways, whether it's painting or yoga or writing in a journal. And so I started writing in a journal. I would write every day. I would write a letter to Rob every day and tell him, like, what I was doing and how I was missing him. And then it just kind of segued into, like, well, maybe if I share my story, that will help other people. So my first book, called Surviving, Finding a Way from Grief to Healing, is pretty much my grief journey. I tell the story of how Rob got sick and what happened when he died, and how I found hope and healing after his loss. And then my second book, Grief, Hope in the Aftermath, is more of a practical guide to grief. And so in that book, I share what I've learned as a bereavement facilitator, facilitating the support groups. And I share in that book some of the stories of people I met in those groups. So at the end of each chapter, there's a little interview kind of blurb that I do from someone who was someone who had that aspect of grief that I was talking about in that chapter. And then I just recently wrote a book this past fall called Surviving Grief, 365 Days a Year. And in that book, you just have to read 1 or 2 pages a day on some aspect of grief and loss. And the good thing about that book is when you're grieving a loss, the last thing you want to do is read War and Peace or some big long book, And so this book seems, people seem to really like the fact that they only have to read a page a day. So honestly, like writing is just like helping other people. I think when you write, it helps you get your feelings out. It helps it get down on paper. And ultimately, it might help somebody else if you share it.
How has your grieving changed you? How are you different now?
I'm a completely different person. So before my loss, my significant loss, which was my spouse, I was such a worrier. I worried about everything and anything. If there was something to worry about, I worried about it. And I always say worrying works because 90% of what we worry about never actually happens. So I worried about everything. Once that happened, I thought to myself, this really horrible thing happened and nothing else will ever hurt me as much as this did. So I'm not afraid anymore. And I think that's what happens with grief is it also makes you afraid. C.S. Lewis said in his book, that no one ever told me that grief felt so like fear. And I think it's true. And so I find that now, before my loss, I was just like everybody else. I think, you watch TV and you see a story maybe about a little girl that was crossing the street and killed by a car, and you say, oh my God, that's horrible. I feel bad for those parents. And then you go and cook dinner and you go back to your life and you do what you're going to do. And you don't really think of what the impact probably was on so many people for even just that one life. And so I think it's made me a more compassionate person. I think it's made me a more empathetic person. I now know when people tell me they lost someone they love, what it feels like, and I'm a little more empathetic to that than I probably was before my losses.
And last question, how do people find hope in that darkness?
I think hope, society wants us to believe that unless you're happy all the time, that you're doing something wrong. And that's not necessarily the case, because I believe that in life is about good and bad. We have good times in our life, we have bad times in our life. So I think if we focus on only the bad times, we're never going to find that joy and happiness that we had before. And I think it's difficult to not confuse like companionship with completeness. So when someone dies, you feel like you're alone. There's nothing good in life anymore. What's the point? But you have to remember that you still matter too. And so I think the way I found hope, and I think that the way you find hope, is knowing that you're here for a reason, and whatever that reason may be, make the best of it, because if you're not doing something you love, you're probably not going to excel at it. And so I think finding hope is about realizing that you can take this loss, have it be a part of the fabric of your life, and then still go on with life and realize that there's still happiness in life, but that you'll always have that sorrow in your heart for the person that you lost. So it's a balance. It's about knowing that joy and grief can coexist in the same place. They're not separate places. And I think that's where you find your hope.
And that's a beautiful place to leave off. Gary, you are just doing the most amazing, selfless work. The world needs more Gary Sturgises. Thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure.
Wow, that's Gary for you. It's so nice to know that there are guiding lights out there willing to help people in the darkest of times. All right, now we're going to switch gears and bring you a little slice of entertainment. Here's Dave and Micaela talking about The Twilight Zone.
The Twilight Zone, a 1959 television series that would debut on a Friday night in October. This was not a show that would follow the examples of its decade peers like I Love Lucy or Bonanza. It would employ an anthology format where a different story would take place with a different cast, usually set within a wide range of genres from the upper echelons of government to the suburbs of America and beyond, usually featuring stories such as aliens visiting Earth, an unruly airplane passenger who may be the only one to save everyone on his flight, or a little doll that may or may not be so friendly. These episodes, more often than not, would feature a morality tale, often with a grim outcome. Joining me today is Micaela Clark, a fellow fan of The Twilight Zone, and we're here to discuss the show both as fans and from a critical standpoint of the show's legacy. Micaela, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So, The Twilight Zone. The impact of it is felt for decades since it debuted on the airwaves in 1959. But I think you have to go back to the very source, its creator, Rod Serling. And Rod Serling, he's an interesting guy. He was a TV writer. He grew up in Binghamton, New York, had an idyllic upbringing, artistically leaning parents who were very supportive of his career. And there really wasn't anything terribly controversial. And then eventually he enlisted in World War II. It was believed that helped shape his experience as a writer. And of course, he eventually pursued a career as a writer. And we would look at his earlier work. It would often explore the themes of morality. In some respects, these scripts would be a precursor to the Twilight Zone. And that would bring us over into live television itself. You had Playhouse 90, the Kraft Television Theater, and Studio One, which was a perfect training ground during live TV. And Serling was working with a team of people that would later include famous directors like John Frankenheimer and Sidney Lumet, writers like Paddy Chayefsky, and actors like Paul Newman. And it's interesting because if you were to look at his work like Patterns, which is the story of a young salesman who is being mentored by an older salesman, only to realize that he's actually being trained to replace the older salesman. It examines a lot of themes in Serling's work. And in this particular thing, youth versus age, success over morality. And Serling wanted to prove that he had more than just being a flash in the pan after Patterns, did Requiem for a Heavyweight. And it was seen as an allegory of Serling proving he's not just a flash in the pan, and to prove the critics wrong. And he clearly did. And as I've said, it would later show as this precursor to the Twilight Zone. And then, of course, that brings us into the actual Twilight Zone, which is just one of the greatest shows ever.
Yeah.
And what I particularly loved about it is that it was a show that was an anthology format, horror, sci-fi, and it had a different cast and a different story. But in a way, they explore more Serling's look at morality. And it's just one of those shows that you did not forget it as soon as you saw it. And these are 25-minute short films. I mean, it was amazing what he was able to do. And the social commentary alone was amazing. I mean, what did you think about that?
Well, Rod Serling certainly wanted to use his writing as a way to get a message out to the public audience. And I think that choosing science fiction, horror, thriller as genres was a particularly savvy choice of his. It's well known that those kinds of stories were the kind of stories that a society produces at a given time tells us about that society more than anything. Because with horror and sci-fi and suspense, that's where society explored its anxieties,
He had once said in an interview, the writer's role is to be a minister of the public's conscience. He must have a position, a point of view. He must see the arts as a vehicle of social criticism, and he must focus on the issues of his time. And what's interesting is that it was said that he resented the role that advertisers played in narrative storytelling. He felt that TV had a responsibility to illuminate social topics. And I mean, at the time, you go to live television, I mean, this was a new format that people were exploring, and he was at the ground floor doing that. And that blows my mind. And with this whole assignment, we ended up taking upon ourselves to highlight 3 episodes of our own that we felt embraced the Twilight Zone in general.
Yeah.
So what was your choice for your first episode?
Well, my first choice, we're going to kick it off with Eye of the Beholder, which the log line is, a young woman lying in a hospital bed, her head wrapped in bandages, awaits the outcome of a surgical procedure performed by the state in a last-ditch attempt to make her look normal. I'm trying to do my Serling impression. I realized halfway through that I should probably be doing that. So I think this is one of the first episodes I ever saw. I think I was about 13. It was the 4th of July marathon, and I saw it on cable TV. So if you're new to the Twilight Zone, which some of you may be, and don't know where to start, this is a perfect place to start. It is one of the best and certainly one of the most iconic episodes. It's been parodied even in Saturday Night Live. It's quintessential Twilight Zone. And what I love about it is it's a perfect encapsulation of the show's strengths, and the cinematography is as gorgeous as it is inventive.
Eye of the Beholder essentially focuses on a woman who's in bandages, and she's had her 11th operation. And the staff pity her. They feel bad for her. But, of course, with the Twilight Zone, it's all about shock value in some episodes at the end. And we find out what the big plot twist is. And it's a play on the idea of beauty is in the eye of the beholder.
Yes.
We know what happens when the big reveal happens, when her bandages are taken off. I think what I found interesting is that episode's about conformity, because beauty really is in the eye of the beholder.
It is.
And the main character is a beautiful woman, and everyone around her perceives her to be ugly. When it's, in some respects, it's inverted. That always blew my mind.
Yeah, I think it really hits home with people, not just because it was such a well-crafted episode, but because it is about how arbitrary standards of beauty are a way in which, I guess, the upper echelons can control people. You know, I would compare this episode with another episode called Number 12 Looks Just Like You, which also has beauty and conformity as its major themes, but Number 12 is more about how your appearance is tied to your identity, and this one is more about beauty being more subjective, which I think is a more impactful. And also, it was just much a goofier episode, Number 12.
Which brings us to Once Upon a Time. On the more lighter spectrum of the Twilight Zone, you had Buster Keaton, silent comedy legend and filmmaker extraordinaire, as this grumpy janitor who essentially complains about the tenets of his time. And then, of course, this is in the early 20th century, maybe earlier, he finds himself transported through a time machine to modern-day America, and he finds that society has progressed to the point where he can't keep up. And it always amazed me because with the Twilight Zone, we often associate it with dour, grim stories. Once Upon a Time was kind of a crown jewel in terms of making it light and fun, but still teaching you something about humanity itself. That's what I loved about it. And you had seen that episode. What was your impression of it?
I just had a lot of fun with it. I mean, it definitely, for me, it didn't feel like a typical Twilight Zone episode, like you said, but I just love Buster Keaton.
I found interesting is that Buster Keaton, essentially, he had established his legacy as a filmmaker with all these silent comedies. And then, without denigrating his legacy, he had essentially taken for higher roles. It just so happened that he happened to be in an episode of The Twilight Zone. And in a way, I'd like to think he only extended his legacy by appearing in one of the greatest television shows of all time. And Buster Keaton was an artist who made, artistically great films. And now he get to be part of television as it was starting to burgeon into that format.
Yes.
That's what I loved about Once Upon a Time. Which also brings us back to the whole darker aspects and I guess the greater mythology of the Twilight Zone. The Howling Man, which was your choice.
Yes.
What was the premise of that episode?
So the premise is seeking refuge from a storm. A traveler comes upon a bizarre abbey of monks who have imprisoned an old man who begs for the traveler's help. When he confronts the head monk, the traveler is told that the man is the devil. He must decide whom to believe. And it is also one of the first episodes I ever watched. And I know that this episode is objectively good. It has like 8.2 on IMDb. But I did choose this solely on personal preference because it is one of the more straight-up horror and gothic episodes of The Twilight Zone. And that's my vibe. That's my jam.
Here's what I loved about it. The episode, for lack of a better word, the exposition is not dragged out. This character wanders into this monastery. And the characters that he meets that run this monastery, they look like shepherds. And the central leader, if you can call him that.
John Carradine.
What's that?
John Carradine.
Oh, that is John Carradine.
Yeah.
Interesting. Hollywood legend, if you don't know that, look him up. But he's a godlike figure, and he warns our main character that this person that is imprisoned in this cell cannot be released. And of course, maybe in some variation on Adam and Eve, temptation versus morality, our main character feels obligated to let this man who's been trapped out. And then, of course, you find out, with it being the Twilight Zone, things aren't what they appear on the surface. And it goes back to the whole morality aspect of the Twilight Zone. We have to pay for our consequences dearly.
Yes.
And that's what happens to our main character here.
I want to talk about, without giving away the ending, there's this really cool old school practical effect. Do you know the one I'm thinking of?
I do.
That's used to really great effect here in this sequence. And it's something that can only be done on black and white film. And if you want to see it without being spoiled, there's a good example. Just go Google like the Jekyll and Hyde 1932.
Okay, we're going to go into a darker aspect here, even darker than The Howling Man, not to one-up you. The New Exhibit, which was just a straight-up horror episode. It's a story of this museum worker who ends up taking home these wax figures of these devious, sinister characters, and they end up committing murder one by one. And everyone looks at him. He's like, I'm not responsible for these murders. But he ends up becoming an accomplice. And then, of course, we find out in the end what the morale is. This main character is doomed, essentially. And I think that's part of the whole inverted reality concept we've seen in later films. Essentially a character who inverts reality. Everyone thinks that he's up to no good, and it's him saying, hey, I'm not crazy. It's someone else who's responsible for these murders. And you had just seen that episode. Was that your first time?
Yes.
Okay.
I thought it was a psycho twist. I thought he was responsible and he's projecting onto inanimate objects.
And then, of course, we find out what happens in the Twilight Zone. Things aren't so easy, which also brings us to something even darker Death's Head Revisited. This is Serling attacking history or
Yes.
redistricting it to something else.
Yes. So, very, very intense, dark episode. I would recommend it, but an ex-Nazi returns to Dachau and finds himself facing a phantom jury made up of his tortured victims. It's a very, very good episode, but again, it is very dark. And what was interesting about this is that there was a trial going on, and in the middle of this trial, which was for a really high-up Holocaust perpetrator, it was from April 61 to December 61, and this was in November 61. And this was Serling commenting on that, him being Jewish himself, saying he's making the case why this matters and why this should still be pursued, because there was a lot of debate about this not being worth pursuing. And basically what he's saying is we must choose to remember because forgetting is an injustice.
And what's interesting is the morale here is the character isn't condemned by trial. Literally, he is condemned to madness for his sins. Which brings us to one last episode, Time Enough at Last, which is one of the more fascinating, iconic episodes as a bookworm, more preoccupied with reading than what's going on in the world, finds himself the only man on Earth who can read. And, of course, we know that it doesn't work out so well in the Twilight Zone. And I always felt that that episode was about anti-intellectualism versus intellectualism itself. And it also goes to a bigger argument about the Twilight Zone. It was said that Serling's stories operated within two frames. A character who deserved a second chance after going through something awful or committing something awful. And then a character who just ultimately deserved a nasty fate. And I always felt that Time Enough at Last perfectly straddles the two.
I don't know. I disagree. I think he definitely did not deserve the fate. I don't see him as an intellectual. I see him more as a romantic. He doesn't critique the literature he reads. He just enjoys the beauty of it.
And I have to say, that's what brings us to what makes the Twilight Zone great. We're still talking about it over, years later. And as far as the legacy goes, I mean, we can't get into all the references it's had, but the Twilight Zone has impacted pop culture countlessly since 1959. I mean, you have Black Mirror, Futurama.
Are You Afraid of the Dark, Goosebumps, tons of Simpsons episodes.
Yes.
But it has basically the idea of a horror anthology format is directly linked to the Twilight Zone. It's kind of the father of that genre.
And you said it yourself, that the Twilight Zone has become part of the vernacular, right?
Yes, it has. The phrase in the Twilight Zone has come to mean an unusual situation or mental state between reality and fantasy.
And the thing about the Twilight Zone, it's not quite horror, it's not quite sci-fi, it's not quite comedy, it's its own thing.
Yeah.
It's Serling embracing together all the genres and tying them up together, which is what I love.
In the blender.
That's a good way to put it. So, that brings us to the Twilight Zone in general, what it's meant to us. For me personally, when I discovered it, it blew my mind that this is something different from everything else I've ever watched. And of course, I remained a lifelong fan. And as we're about to wrap up here, what do you have to say about the show's meaning to you?
Well, I'm a simple gal, and I just love good old-fashioned fun. And also, as both an aspiring filmmaker, I definitely see it as a major source of inspiration, not just on a technical side, but also an example of storytelling as a form of activism, of social good, and doing it with a kind of flair.
And Serling wasn't afraid to ask questions. He did it, and he's still doing it years later. Well, that's it for today's session of Open Here, submitted for your approval. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
And Micaela enters the chat. Thanks, guys. I also want to thank Gary Sturgis for being our guest today. It's so nice to know there are guiding lights out there. And of course, I want to thank you for giving us a listen. You've been listening to Open Here, a podcast produced by Plymouth Area Community Television. PACTV is the community media provider for the Massachusetts towns of Plymouth, Pembroke, Kingston, and Duxbury. To see more of our content, visit pactv.org/thelocalscene. I'm Tiff Phillips. Thanks for tuning in. Let's hang out again soon.